Howdy, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's Seaside Chat. Today, we have a great guest speaker. This is Tony Reisinger. He is Texas Sea Grant's Marine agent, and he is going to be talking to us about red tide in Texas and his work with the Red Tide Rangers. Thank you so much for joining us, Tony.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before you get started, we do have some polls for our participants to fill out. So I'm going to make those live, and if y'all could fill that out, that would be really great for us. There we go. Awesome. Thanks, you guys. All right, Tony, take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, let me pull my screen up. I can find it. It's not there. Huh. Maybe it is. I'm working on it. Okay, I have no idea what that is. Let me get out of it now. Okay, I'm having technical difficulties. Let me look again. Ah, there it is. Got it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about red tide today. And I am the Cameron County Marine Extension Agent. I've been here in South Texas for almost 39 years now. And I work for Texas Sea Grant and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and Cameron County. So what is an algal bloom? Red tide is considered an algal bloom. It's a rapid increase in aquatic algae. And there's no specific threshold. And we usually measure it in cells per milliliter down here, but some people measure it in cells per liter, which is 1,000 times more than that. And it's usually indicated by a water change. This is a shot here of South Padre Island in 2015, I believe it was. And that is a red tide bloom that is occurring off of South Padre at that time. A harmful algal bloom is when phytoplankton produces a biotoxin in large concentrations. And especially red tide, it can impact fish and people. As you can see on the bottom, they're wearing masks to protect themselves. And I'll get to that in a minute. We have several types of harmful algal blooms that occur off of South Texas and Texas in general. One is brown tide, and that started in like 1990 in the lower Laguna Madre and lasted for a couple of years. And it caused the water to become very cloudy, and people that were fishing could not see the fish. They could not do sight fishing. And so they had to depend on bait more than, say, artificial lures that fish could see. But eventually it did go away. They think it was caused by a fish kill from a freeze in 1989, very similar to what we just had. But this year they thought we might get one, but we didn't have near the amount of fish that died during this freeze as we did in 89, and another one that we had in 1983. But 89 was the big one that contributed to the brown tide bloom. Golden algae is another one, and it can occur in estuarine waters and in ponds. I've had a golf course called that they were having a fish kill, and Parks and Wildlife came out, and it was in McAllen, and it was a golden algae bloom that killed the fish. Dinophysis is another one. It's pretty nasty, and they close shellfish growing areas when that occurs, as they do when we have a red tide. Red tide is called Karenia brevis, and I did spell that wrong, I see. It's named after a lady in Florida who did quite a bit of work on red tide. So let's talk a little bit about red tide. It's a single-celled algae. It's so small. It's small enough that you can actually see it in the water if you get down very close and look at it, and the sunlight is just right. Looks like a swarm of bees swimming through the water. And it swims through the water. It spins and goes forward. And I've got a drawing of one, and it spins using flagellae. There's one that wraps around it, and there's another one that comes out what we'll call the tail end. This is a picture of some red tide cells that I took with a small camera, and they were stained so that you could see them better. The red spots are the actual nuclei of the red tide cells. And then this is another photomicrograph of one that's, I guess, more detailed than in any of the other stuff that we can see. It's transported inshore by currents off of Texas, and I'll go into that in a little while. Florida is currently experiencing a red tide. They've been being hit, I guess, several years in a row with it. And their red tide comes from the deep waters that are offshore the Florida shelf. Red tide produces a potent neurotoxin called Brevetoxin. Some historic notes on it. The Spaniards that were in Texas in the 1500s had warnings on taking shellfish in the fall. And usually when a red tide bloom does occur, it happens during that time period. We've had 13 significant red tides since 1986. And in 86, we had over 80 million fish that succumbed to the toxin. Before 1986, we only had 3 reported red tides. So it seems to be getting more frequent in occurrence. In 1935, it's interesting that the people in Corpus Christi thought there was a volcano offshore producing noxious gases because Brevetoxin gets suspended as an aerosol in the air because the cells break and release the toxin. And depending on which way the wind is blowing, if it's blowing toward you, you can breathe it, and it affects your respiratory system. Brevetoxin is derived from the Karenia brevis. I said it was contained in the cells, and it's linked to deaths of seabirds, turtles, dolphins, manatees, and canines. And I'll talk about the canines in just a little bit. One unusual circumstance that we had on South Padre was an early, I guess, red tide, probably in the 1990s. And freshwater fish that were in ponds on South Padre, they all died. And we had a red tide bloom going on, but no red tide was getting into those ponds. So we think that the Brevetoxin was suspended as an aerosol, and the aerosol dropped into those ponds, and it was enough to kill those fish. Those fish are very sensitive. In 2015, we had significant mortalities of invertebrates, things that we had never seen before: ghost shrimp, mole, and hermit crabs, and even bivalves. And we wondered, are they being killed by the toxin, or are they being killed by something else? And we found out that red tide can use up, if it's in high enough concentration, it can use up all the oxygen in a local area. And so that's what we suspect happened to those invertebrates. Ground squirrels and juvenile dolphin were impacted. I think in 2015, the dolphin had to be rescued off the Brazo Santiago jetties, which are on the south end of South Padre Island. And the ground squirrels, we had like 10 of them die. They were found dead in the sand dunes along South Padre Island. And we don't really know how they ingested the Brevetoxin. It concentrates in oysters, mussels, clams, whelks, and scallops. Whelks look like a conch, but they eat other animals, and the toxin bioaccumulates in those whelks. And when you eat, say, oysters or whelks or scallops that have ingested the toxin, then you can get neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, which is not killed by cooking. So how is brevetoxin delivered from the red tide cells? Gills of fish can break the cells while they're swimming through the water and absorb the toxin directly into their bloodstream. And I also mentioned earlier that it does aerosolize when waves break. And if the wind is blowing onshore, and it depends on the amount of cells that are in the water as to the intensity of the aerosol. And trophic transfer it moves all the way through the food chain. We can even ingest some of it, more so directly if we eat contaminated shellfish, but other animals do accumulate it. And like I said, it affects other mammals, fish, you name the animal, and it's probably impacted by it, except for maybe crabs and shrimp, and we don't know why. The Cameron County Health Department has sent out warnings for red tide so that people with pets do not take they warn them not to take their pets to the beach, because like I said earlier, red tide has killed canines, and we lost a Labrador puppy on the Padre Island National Seashore during one year during a red tide. And I think it was a couple of other labs. Also, we have seen several coyotes die from red tide, and they were tested for the brevetoxin in their systems, and it was found. So we don't know what other implications red tide is having on us when we experience it. So we did Dr. Paul Zimba's lab did some tests on mullet that had died during a red tide and washed up on the beach on South Padre Island. And it was during the time of a drought. So they were on the beach for well over a month. And what he did was he detected red tide. It dropped very quickly. It degraded slowly after almost 3.5 days, but it was still there. So we suspect that when the coyotes consume fish on the beach, coyotes will eat almost anything. They gorge themselves because they haven't eaten in a while, and these dead fish are washing in, and we suspect that that's enough of the toxin to actually kill them. And it's also suspected that some of, like the Labradors, the pup, I think it was a puppy, sniffs some of the foam that washes up with the waves, and that may concentrate the brevetoxin in that particular foam, and so that could have caused their death. So what are the human effects? Causes respiratory, nose, throat, and eye irritation, coughing and sneezing. And we found that the best thing is a respiratory mask or a dust mask to wear on your face, and that basically catches the aerosolized droplets on the mask, and you don't inhale that, so you don't really have any reaction. Cell concentration in the water and the wind direction and velocity and wave action determine the amount of aerosol that can be available to you when a red tide bloom is occurring. I talked about neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. It can cause a reversal of sensations. You can pick up something hot and it will feel cold, and vice versa. And it causes all kinds of other symptoms, but it's not known to, I guess maybe they think one person may have died from consuming it, but I haven't seen the report on it. But shellfish do accumulate it, and the State Department of Health Services sends out, or they close shellfish harvesting areas when we do have a red tide. And if we detect a concentration of around 5 cells per milliliter, they will close that area to shellfish harvesting. These are some of the fish that we see that are affected with it. The canary in the mine is Gulf menhaden. That is a filter feeder. That's the one at the bottom there. And it filters out the red tide cells, and then they break inside the gills and they die or they're poisoned. So it's toxic to them, and they're one of the first ones that we see. We'll see them swimming around on the surface of the water, and many of them doing that, swimming in circles. Another one that's impacted a lot are striped mullet, but all of these species can succumb, and all of the fish species that I know of can succumb to this, especially red drum. During the fall, red drum are spawning, and the eggs will hatch, and then they move inshore with the tide. So if we have a red tide going on, we suspect that it could possibly affect the population of red drum. Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists have said they suspect that it does impact the population to some extent, but they can't really tell how much. But you can see these are red drum that were washed up on the beach on north of South Padre Island a few years ago. The last red tide we did have was 2018, but we just found like one cell. It wasn't significant. 2017, we had a small fish kill, but we really couldn't find any evidence of red tide after that. And I mentioned earlier about the impacts on shrimp and crabs. One shrimp fisherman reported that he picked up his rigs and caught a lot of dead shrimp in his net during a red tide bloom. But we don't know if they were killed by the toxin or by the lack of oxygen, if it was a heavy bloom in that area. We didn't really get to sample it. The only crabs that we know die from it are hermit crabs, and I may have a photo of that coming up. It does have economic impacts. We see around 10% decline in hotel motel taxes. Recreational fishing is probably one of the biggest fisheries impacted, because people hear there's a red tide, then they don't even want to come down and fish or even visit. And if we put on a training for volunteers to test for it, we get calls or just train people to be ready for a bloom. We get calls from the public saying, we heard there's a red tide, is it true? And so it's even hard to just say you're going to train people to check for it, to be ready if one does happen. The red tide blooms are usually spotty. You saw the picture, that Parks and Wildlife picture when I first started the show, that there were high concentrations in one area and you couldn't really see it in other spots. So fishermen, fishing guides sometimes know if there's an area in the Laguna Madre that there is no red tide, and they can take you fishing there and it'll be safe. So you need to, if you want to go fishing during a red tide bloom, check with the guides, because they know pretty much where it is and where it isn't. And we're finding better ways now to actually determine the extent of a bloom, and we can even predict where it's going now. Shellfish harvesting impacts, I mentioned that earlier, that 5 cells per milliliter is when the Texas Department of State Health Services closes the harvesting of shellfish. And conditions that are favorable to a red tide, we really don't know all the conditions, but we do know that it likes warm, calm water. We think that iron coming from Saharan dust contributes to a bloom, but we didn't have any blooms in Texas when we had some heavy dust from the Sahara coming in, I think it was a year or two ago. So we don't really know for sure about that. Nitrogen, we know it likes nitrogen, and Gulf Stream eddies that are turning in opposite directions can send a jet of water from offshore and push any red tide that might be out in the Gulf of Mexico. We know it's always out there in background concentrations. in the Gulf, but we don't know just why a bloom gets triggered off the coast of Texas. It likes droughts, and we're going into one now, but I'm not going to predict whether we're going to have a red tide. Texas A&M figured out where the blooms originate, though, in the Gulf of Mexico, and that is the Bay of Campeche, which is down in this area to the south. And they did a long study, and it's now accepted by most scientists that that is the area where the blooms originate. This is what it would look like if we had a red tide bloom originate in the Bay of Campeche. It would move up, and it usually hits the coast in mid-September, sometimes as early as July, and then it's pushed south by the prevailing winds. Winds drive our currents. That you may know that, and the winds usually change during September from the north. Primarily, many of them come from the north, and they push those blooms south. However, in 1986, we had a red tide start on the upper coast of Texas, and it covered the whole coast, killing, I think it was 22 million fish in all, if my memory is right. So how do we predict it and how do we monitor it? We depend on NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They look at the Gulf via satellite, and we also cooperate with Texas A&M and the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. They have these devices called cytobots that are they're the canary for prediction, the canary in the mine for prediction. They actually pull samples out of the water continuously and can identify when they see red tide cells passing through, and they take pictures of it. And the scientists at A&M and UTRGV will warn us that we may have a red tide coming up. Also, we check news from Mexico, and we also work with the National Weather Service. Real-time monitoring is NOAA harmful algal bloom bulletins, and Texas Parks and Wildlife has a harmful algal bloom work group that meets usually before the season where we could possibly expect a red tide, and we plan how we will respond to it. We also have a group called the Red Tide Rangers, and I'll get to them in a minute. And we have coastal naturalists and other volunteers. Then we have a new device called a HAB scope that was developed by NOAA, and it can quickly determine if there is red tide and send that information electronically to a central point in the Northern Gulf where it can be put together to determine where it is. And then NOAA can use satellites to actually track and predict what's going on. Concentration classifications, background is usually less than 1 cell per milliliter. 1 to 10 cells per milliliter is very low, and moderate is 100 to 1,000. That's about the point where we start feeling an aerosol, usually when we have moderate concentrations. And then high or greater than that, it gets pretty bad. Breathing is fairly tough. If you're an asthmatic, you don't even want to go to the beach. You need to avoid it and wear a mask too, and stay indoors if you happen to live on South Padre Island. So this is a NOAA HAB Bulletin. This one's from 2015. And you can see that they found concentrations of it offshore of South Texas. And some of these dots are information that's ground truth information that our volunteers take and count cells, like the group called the Red Tide Rangers. We've also tried unmanned aerial vehicles to see whether we can detect it. And this is a professor, Dr. Jude Benavides from UTRGV, University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, flying one of those devices over offshore of South Padre Island. And this is a shot of the heavy bloom on the right-hand side, and you can see delineation right through the middle, and there's probably less of a bloom on this side, but we were able to pick it up. The Texas A&M Corpus Christi also did some aerial work using UAVs. And this is one that's flying off of the Coastal Studies Lab on South Padre Island. The UTRGV Coastal Studies Lab is our main partner in monitoring red tides off of South Texas. This is what the Texas A&M Corpus picked up for the red tide. All of this red is breaking waves, so it's a lot of, I guess, bubbles. But see this pink area? I outlined it earlier. All of this pink area, they think may have been red tide when they flew that UAV over South Padre Island during a bloom. So Alex Nuñez, he heads up the Texas Parks and Wildlife Harmful Algal Bloom Work Group, and he monitors what's happening. And he told us about, I guess this was a recent or fairly recent red tide, and some of the fish kill that was going on. And you can see that shrimp eels on the beach were the dominant species, and then the fish kill on the inshore area was pinfish were the dominant species. I mentioned that we lost invertebrates on South Padre Island in 2015, mole crabs and hermit crabs. There is a fish skull in there, but these are all skeletons or exoskeletons of mole crabs and hermit crabs that we assume were taken out by the high concentration of cells and maybe lack of oxygen. We work very closely with Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists. They monitor the area. Their major job, though, is to assess the damage to the fisheries resource. So it's good. We work with them because we provide them with information on what the bloom is doing, what the cell counts are out there. And this is a shot in the Brownsville Ship Channel. And I said it was spotty earlier, but this is a high concentration along the shore of a red tide bloom. We actually sampled it, and I think it was 55,000 cells per milliliter, and that was 2011. We lose redfish, and this is along the Brownsville Ship Channel. That's what these little areas, little pockets of red tide were doing. They were knocking out the red drum that were moving up and down there. We've even had tarpon taken out by a red tide bloom. You can see the greenish reddish color to the water there. That was a pretty heavy bloom that was occurring at that time. These are what the cells look like under a microscope. This is not a red tide cell, but this one looks different because it's just oriented in a different direction. And what we have to do is count all of the cells in 1 milliliter of water. And this is one that's a close-up. I mentioned that in, I think, 2018, we did find one cell, so we couldn't really say we had a bloom, but it was out there. Red tide does like nutrients, and this shows that nitrogen has an impact on the growth of it and may contribute to the blooms. When it does get in the bay, we've noticed that it lasts a longer amount of time. So we figure that nutrients coming out of a stream that runs all through the Rio Grande Valley called the Arroyo Colorado, which drains most of the cities, it contributes nutrients to the Laguna Madre and may be responsible for the longer time period that the cells exist in the cells exist in the Laguna Madre. We formed a group called the Texas Red Tide Rangers in the 1990s because we had a bloom, and we were at the Coastal Studies Lab on South Padre Island, and we asked people to bring us in water samples, and we would count them. We would determine what the counts of the red tide cells were. Well, we got overwhelmed. Every sink was filled up with baggies that were full of water samples from different areas around South Padre Island and Port Isabel, and even Port Mansfield. So we couldn't count them. So we decided to ask the volunteers if they would like to learn how to count the cells, and they did, and they became red tide rangers. And they've lasted up until now, and we've got a good future ahead of us. We've had over 200 people trained in being red tide rangers, but they don't all stick around because red tides don't come at us every year. Like I say, they're getting more frequent, but we haven't had, I guess, a real bloom since 2016. 2017, we had a little fish kill, 2018, one cell, and we don't know what this year holds. So, oh, I mentioned the HAB scope earlier, and this is a picture of it. And what it is a microscope and a iPod on the device. And what it does is it uses facial recognition to identify the cells while they're alive, because they're swimming all through a droplet of water. And it can give you an approximate cell count, and it's getting better at estimating the number of cells per milliliter as time passes. The scientists are working on that. And then it sends this information via cell phone to a site in the northern Gulf of Mexico where it's accumulated and assessed. This is what a typical bloom looks like as far as the population. This is the number of cells on the left-hand side, and on the bottom, it's over days. And these are from samples taken by the red tide rangers. So you can see it gets up in the thousands of cells per milliliter about 20 days into the bloom from when we first started sampling. And then it goes away. We don't know whether it uses all the nutrients or what. There's still a lot to learn. If there's any of you out there that are young enough to go to school and study red tide, we would really like to know what really controls it. So how is the red tide ranger data used? Well, Texas, the Texas Department, or the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department has a website, and they publish the current status of red tide on it. You can Google red tide, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and they will update you. And right now, if you go there, nothing's going on, so they don't have any information. And also the NOAA publishes the HAB Bulletin, and you can see off South Texas where we were having a bloom during this one. We also work with university researchers and press releases too. So I mentioned earlier that red tide rangers would get bored because we didn't have red tides going on every year. So we tried to figure out what else could they do. And we started a group called the Texas Coastal Naturalists. And you have to take like 3 courses to become a Texas Coastal Naturalist. And we offer the courses at the Coastal Studies Lab and other places. We have them work with oil spills, but they really can't handle the animals. They can only take data. And so every once in a while we'll have a course in that. But they do respond to cold stun sea turtle events like this last event. We had coastal naturalists involved in rescuing some, I guess it was 5,600 cold stun sea turtles down here in South Texas in the Laguna Madre and on the beaches. Also, they respond to marine mammal strandings. This is a coastal naturalist that's holding this was a small whale that came ashore, but it didn't survive. And this is one of our volunteer veterinarians, Dr. Tom DeMar. We work very closely with him. In fact, he worked hard on the cold stun sea turtle event that we had in February. Also, our Texas coastal naturalist will rescue pelicans that are dropping down out of the sky onto Highway 48 when a north wind parallels the direction of the road, usually at a place called Bahia Grande. And the Texas Department of Transportation is working very closely to remedy this situation. They think that there's turbulence caused by some of the barriers there, and they actually replaced one barrier and are probably looking at limiting traffic flow through that one particular spot during a norther or a north wind event. but we don't, that's in the future. We really don't know what's going to happen. And these are some, I think I showed some of these pictures already. I did mention the HAB scope earlier, and that is the future of the red tide rangers. We'll still depend on counting cells microscopically in 1 milliliter water, but we're going to move on and use this HAB scope for a program called Every Beach, Every Day. And we'll be able to tell you where red tide is and where it isn't in the future. And that is very promising because they are doing it in Florida and it's working well. The only thing is right now you have to have concentrations of around 1,000 cells per milliliter. And that's where we usually start picking up the respiration problems that we have. So we're working on that, and that's our future. And I think, oh, I've got one other thing. We do have some other blooms that happen, and these, this particular one was Portuguese man-o-wars that washed up several years ago. And it usually happens in, I guess, midwinter around February. And then in April, we had these by the wind sailors, and they're very small. They're about maybe 3 inches long at the most. These washed up on Boca Chica Beach. This particular, the Portuguese man-o-wars washed up on South Padre Island and a little north of the city of South Padre Island. And those are a lot more dangerous than the by the wind sailors. They're types of jellyfish, but the sting on the Portuguese man-o-wars is much more potent than the by the wind sailors. So that's some other things that and there's another one that I didn't have a picture of called the blue button. Sometimes they wash up in large numbers. It's really an interesting place down here in South Texas. And I enjoy working here. So red tide impacts tourism, sport fishing, shellfish harvesting, and respiratory effects on us. But we can do things about some of these. Respiratory, we can wear the mask. And it also has a potential impact on offshore aquaculture. Offshore aquaculture is being looked at here off of South Texas. It's been attempted I think for redfish. They tried it and it was fairly successful. So we're going to look at that in the future. But what will the impact if a red tide, or if it moves into an area where they're growing fish, it could wipe them out. So it's become more prevalent lately, although we haven't seen one since a good one since 2016. It affects tourism. It's a concern for mariculture. Nitrogen, we think, is the anthropogenic contributor to the blooms, at least in the inshore area of South Texas. We know the prevailing currents in the fall provide transport inshore from a bloom that might be moving up from the Bay of Campeche. And the red tides disrupt the ecosystems and human populations. The economic impacts are unpredictable. Human health effects are as yet undetermined. And also the blooms are unpredictable. But we think we can do something about them being unpredictable by having better monitoring by using the HAB scope in the future. We think that may be our future. And that's it. Any questions? Or I think we have a survey, right?
Yes, we do. I'm going to send out that poll while everybody thinks of some good questions.
These are hard questions.
Awesome. Thanks for filling that out, y'all. I'll give y'all a few more minutes in case anybody has a question. That was such a cool talk, Tony. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't know how long I took. Let me see. About 40 minutes. Wow. Maybe 30. 35.
I actually have a quick question. Whenever y'all have like jellyfish blooms, like the man-o-war and the by-the-wind sailors, do those have to be cleaned up by people, or will animals eat those?
They usually wash down the beach, that the tides take care of them fairly quickly. The city of South Padre Island, if they get something like that, they clean their beaches. So they would probably rake them up and put them in an area that contributes to the nutrition for sand dunes. So
Interesting.
yeah.
That was so cool. Well, if nobody has any questions, I guess this concludes our Seaside Chat. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us, and I hope y'all will stay tuned for next chat. Thank you guys so much. Have a great Wednesday.
Thank you, Chloe.
Bye.
Adios.